Mike Harrison's calloused fingers froze around the rusted chain. The metallic rattle echoed exactly like dog tags falling in Afghanistan dust 4 years ago. The September Texas heat pressed down like a furnace, but his blood ran ice cold. Below him, skeletal ribs rose and fell beneath matted German shepherd fur that had once gleamed like burnished copper. Rex? The name cracked from his throat like splintering wood. They'd told him Rex was dead, killed in transport, hero's burial at Arlington. But here, in this godforsaken concrete cage behind an unmarked building 60 miles from nowhere, amber eyes struggled to focus through pain-clouded recognition. The same eyes that had watched for roadside bombs. The same eyes that had trusted him completely. 4 years of believing a lie. 4 years of nightmares about abandoning his battle buddy. The government forms were wrong. The death certificate was wrong. Everything was wrong except this moment, this impossible, heartbreaking moment of finding what he'd mourned as lost forever. "Good boy, Rex," Mike whispered, his voice breaking. "Good boy." Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Mike Harrison had always believed that surviving 3 tours in Afghanistan meant he could handle anything civilian life threw at him. At 58, his weathered hands still moved with military precision, whether adjusting the mirrors on his pickup truck or folding the American flag that hung above his fireplace in the small ranch house outside Austin. The divorce papers had been signed 18 months ago, leaving him with half his pension, a mortgage, and the kind of silence that made a man hear echoes of gunfire in every backfiring engine. The sleepless nights weren't new. They'd started in Kandahar province, where the Taliban had a particular talent for hiding improvised explosive devices in roadside garbage. What was new was the way his chest tightened every time he saw a German shepherd on television, every time he heard a dog bark in the VA hospital parking lot, where he worked part-time helping other veterans navigate their disability claims. The nightmares always featured the same scene, Rex's amber eyes watching him board the transport plane home, the promise echoing between them like a sacred oath. Rex had been 4 years old when they'd first partnered up. 85 pounds of muscle, intelligence, and unwavering loyalty wrapped in a coat that gleamed like polished mahogany in the Afghan sun. Military working dog teams weren't just partnerships. They were marriages of necessity, forged in the kind of crucible that either created unbreakable bonds or devastating failure. Rex had saved Mike's life twice in their 18 months together. The first time, detecting an IED buried beneath what looked like an innocent pile of stones. The second time, alerting to a sniper's position 3 seconds before the shot that would have taken Mike's head clean off. They'd shared everything. MREs that tasted like cardboard, the cramped quarters of forward operating bases, the hyper-vigilant scanning of every shadow and movement that kept them alive. Rex responded to German commands, Platz for down, Bleib for stay, Such for search, the traditional language of military working dogs that created an additional layer of security. When Mike whispered Guter Hund in the dark hours before dawn patrols, Rex's tail would thump once against his sleeping bag, a Morse code of mutual understanding. The day Mike's rotation ended, he'd knelt in the dust beside Rex's kennel and made the promise that had haunted him ever since. "I'll get you home, buddy. Whatever it takes, I'll get you home." Rex had pressed his massive head against the chain link, amber eyes holding Mike's gaze with an intensity that suggested he understood every word. The Army had different plans. "Dogs stay with the unit," they'd explained with bureaucratic efficiency. "Rex will rotate home with the next handler," except Rex never made it home. 3 weeks after Mike's departure, the official notification arrived. Transport accident during routine transfer. Rex was listed as killed in action, eligible for military honors. a line item in the vast machinery of war. Mike had grieved like a man who'd lost his son. 3 weeks before Mike Harrison would find himself staring at a skeletal German Shepherd through chain-link fencing, he was knee-deep in kennel duty at the Austin Animal Rescue, scrubbing water bowls with the methodical precision that 20 years in the Marines had ingrained in his bones. The volunteer work kept his hands busy and his mind focused on something other than the empty house that echoed with memories of a marriage that had slowly bled out over arguments about his night terrors and the way he still set his alarm for Aero 500 every morning. Sarah Mitchell, the volunteer coordinator, emerged from the office carrying a clipboard and wearing the expression of someone wrestling with difficult news. At 35, she possessed the kind of quiet competence that reminded Mike of the best officers he'd served under: direct, compassionate, but never willing to sugarcoat hard truths. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her hands bore the small scars that came from years of working with frightened animals. "Mike," she said, her voice carrying an unusual hesitancy, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to promise me you won't do anything reckless." Mike straightened, his shoulders automatically squaring in the way that old habits die hard. "What kind of reckless are we talking about?" Sarah glanced around the kennel area, ensuring they were alone except for the soft whimpering of a three-legged beagle named Charlie who'd been surrendered the previous week. "There's been talk, rumors, really, about a place about 60 miles southeast of here, some kind of training facility." The scrub brush slipped from Mike's hands, clattering against the metal kennel floor with a sound that made Charlie flinch. "What kind of training facility?" "The kind that doesn't advertise," Sarah said carefully. "A volunteer from Bastrop mentioned it last week. Said they heard stories about military dogs being repurposed, dogs that were supposed to be retired or transferred to civilian handlers." She paused, studying Mike's face. "Dogs that were reported as deceased, but might not actually be dead." Mike's chest tightened, the familiar sensation of his heart rate spiking that usually preceded his worst anxiety attacks. The concrete floor seemed to shift beneath his feet, and for a moment he was back in Afghanistan, listening to intelligence reports about enemy positions that could mean the difference between coming home and being shipped back in a flag-draped box. "Did they mention what kind of dogs?" His voice sounded strange in his own ears, hollow and distant. Sarah's expression softened with the kind of pity that made Mike want to punch something. "German Shepherds, mostly. Some Belgian Malinois. Dogs with overseas deployment records." She hesitated again. "Mike, one of the volunteers mentioned seeing a dog that matched Rex's description. Older male, dark coat, what looked like shrapnel scars on his left shoulder." The world went silent except for the sound of blood rushing in Mike's ears. Rex's scars were distinctive, 3 parallel lines where hot metal had torn through muscle and fur during their second deployment, a souvenir from a mortar attack that had nearly taken them both. Mike had held pressure on those wounds while the medic worked, whispering promises in German that Rex would be fine, that they'd both make it home. "Where?" The word came out sharper than Mike intended. Sarah pulled a folded piece of paper from her pocket. "I wrote down what little information we have, but Mike, listen to me. If this is real, if Rex is really alive somewhere, you need to involve the authorities. You can't just—" Mike took the paper with hands that trembled imperceptibly. The address was written in Sarah's careful script, along with a description that could have been any German Shepherd in Texas or could have been the one dog that haunted his dreams. Unmarked building, chain-link fencing, private property signs, no official business license on file with the county. "How long has this place been operating?" Mike asked, already calculating drive times and surveillance angles. "That's just it, nobody knows. The property was purchased 18 months ago through some kind of shell corporation, cash transaction. The few neighbors out there say they've heard dogs barking, but it's so remote that most people just mind their own business." Sarah reached out and touched Mike's arm. "Promise me you'll call the sheriff first, or the ASPCA, or someone official." Mike nodded, but they both knew it was the kind of nod that carried no real commitment. He'd spent too many years following official channels, filling out forms in triplicate, waiting for bureaucrats to make decisions that should have taken minutes instead of months. Rex had been listed as killed in action for 4 years. If there was even a 1% chance that some incompetent desk jockey had filed the wrong paperwork, if Rex was alive and suffering while Mike waited for official approval to investigate. The paper felt like it was burning a hole in his pocket as he finished his volunteer shift with mechanical efficiency. That night, lying in his empty house with the air conditioning struggling against the September heat, Mike stared at the coordinates until the numbers blurred together. Sleep, when it finally came, brought dreams of amber eyes and broken promises. The Texas sunrise cut through the morning mist like a blade, painting the sky in shades of amber and gold that reminded Mike of Rex's eyes in better days. He'd left his ranch house at 0500, muscle memory overriding rational thought, the same way he'd started every patrol in Afghanistan. The drive southeast had taken him through increasingly desolate country, past failed strip malls and sun-bleached billboards advertising long-defunct businesses, into territory where cell phone towers grew sparse and the only traffic consisted of 18-wheelers hauling crude oil toward Houston refineries. The coordinates led him down a farm-to-market road that hadn't seen fresh asphalt since the Clinton administration. Mesquite trees lined both sides, their thorny branches reaching across the pavement like arthritic fingers. Mike's pickup truck kicked up dust clouds that hung in the still air, and he found himself automatically checking the rearview mirror for vehicles that might be following. Old habits from a war zone where paranoia kept you breathing. The facility appeared suddenly, almost hidden behind a natural rise in the landscape. Chain-link fencing topped with razor wire stretched in a rough rectangle around several metal buildings that looked like they'd been erected quickly and without much concern for aesthetics. A faded sign warned private property, no trespassing, authorized personnel only. But there was no company name, no indication of what kind of business operated behind those gates. Mike parked his truck a quarter-mile down the road, hidden behind a copse of live oak trees, and approached on foot. 20 years of military training had taught him the value of reconnaissance, of understanding terrain and threats before committing to action. The morning air carried sounds that made his heart race, the distant barking of multiple dogs, not the happy yipping of pets at play, but the desperate, repetitive barking of animals in distress. The perimeter fence was 12 feet high, designed more to keep things in than to keep people out. Security cameras were mounted at irregular intervals, but their positioning suggested someone more concerned with monitoring the interior than watching for external threats. Mike circled the facility twice, noting weak points in the fencing where erosion had created gaps beneath the chain link, identifying blind spots where the cameras couldn't reach. It was during his second circuit that he heard it, a bark that made his blood freeze in his veins. Every dog had a distinctive voice, as individual as human speech patterns, and Mike had listened to Rex bark through 18 months of combat patrols. This bark carried the same deep, authoritative tone, but underneath it was something new. A note of desperation that cut through Mike's chest like shrapnel. The sound came from the largest building, a corrugated metal structure with few windows and what appeared to be ventilation systems running along the roof. Mike pressed himself against the fence, straining to hear more, and was rewarded with another bark. Definitely Rex's voice, but hoarse and strained in a way that suggested prolonged distress. Military training warred with civilian caution as Mike weighed his options. The logical course was to retreat, contact authorities, file reports, and wait for official investigations that might take weeks or months. But Rex, if it really was Rex, might not have weeks or months. The barking had grown weaker even in the few minutes Mike had been listening. Using wire cutters from his truck's toolbox, Mike created a gap in the fence where erosion had already weakened the foundation. The hole was barely large enough for his shoulders, requiring him to army crawl through loose dirt that stained his clothes and filled his mouth with the taste of drought and desperation. Inside the perimeter, Mike moved with the ghost-quiet precision that had kept him alive during night raids in hostile territory. The facility's layout was haphazard, buildings scattered without apparent plan, as if whoever had constructed this place cared more about concealment than efficiency. The largest building loomed ahead, its metal walls radiating heat even in the early morning coolness. A side door stood slightly ajar, secured only by a simple padlock that Mike could have picked with his eyes closed. The interior was a maze of concrete-floored corridors lined with chain-link cages, each barely large enough for a dog to stand and turn around. The smell hit him like a physical blow: urine, feces, disinfectant, and underneath it all, the metallic scent of fear and pain. Most of the cages were occupied. Mike counted at least 20 dogs as he moved deeper into the building, all of them bearing the lean, muscled build of working animals. German Shepherds, Belgian Malinois, a few mixed breeds that looked like they'd been bred for intelligence and endurance rather than appearance. Many showed signs of inadequate care: protruding ribs, dull coats, eyes that tracked movement with the hypervigilance of animals that had learned to expect pain. But it was Cage 17 that stopped Mike's heart completely. The nameplate read, "Shepherd, male, aggressive," but Mike would have recognized the occupant without any identification. Rex lay on his side on the concrete floor, his once magnificent coat reduced to patches of matted fur that revealed angry red skin underneath. His ribs stood out in sharp relief, and his breathing was shallow and labored. But it was the scars that confirmed what Mike's heart already knew. 3 parallel lines across the left shoulder where shrapnel had torn through muscle and fur 4 years ago in Afghanistan. "Rex," Mike whispered, his voice barely audible even to himself. The dog's ear twitched, a movement so slight it might have been involuntary. Rex's eyes opened slowly, amber irises clouded with pain and exhaustion. For a moment there was no recognition, just the dull stare of an animal that had given up hope. Then something shifted, a flicker of awareness that made Rex's head lift slightly from the concrete. Mike knelt beside the cage, his hands trembling as he reached through the chain link. "Bleib, Rex, bleib." The German command came automatically, a bridge across 4 years of separation and betrayal. Rex's eyes focused with visible effort, and Mike saw the exact moment when recognition dawned. The big dog's tail gave a weak thump against the concrete floor, not the enthusiastic wagging of their reunion fantasies, but the cautious acknowledgement of an animal that had learned not to trust his own hope. "Good boy," Mike whispered, tears streaming down his face as he worked the lock on Rex's cage. "Good boy. I'm here now. I'm going to get you out of here." Rex was too weak to stand on his own, forcing Mike to lift 60 pounds of German Shepherd that should have weighed 85. Rex's head lolled against Mike's shoulder, and he could feel the dog's labored breathing against his neck. The other dogs watched in silence as Mike carried Rex toward the exit, their eyes holding the desperate hope of prisoners watching a fellow inmate's escape. The return journey to Mike's truck felt like the longest patrol of his life. The emergency veterinary clinic in Austin operated with the controlled chaos of a field hospital, and Dr. Patricia Morgan moved through the examining room with the steady competence of someone who'd spent 30 years treating animals that couldn't explain where it hurt. She was a woman in her early 60s, her silver hair pulled back in a practical bun, her hands gentle but firm as she examined the skeletal German Shepherd that Mike had carried through her doors like a broken promise made flesh. Rex lay on the stainless steel table, too weak to resist the examination, his amber eyes tracking between Mike's face and the veterinarian's hands with the wariness of an animal that had learned to expect pain from human contact. "Doctor." Morgan's expression grew increasingly grim as she worked, her fingers probing Rex's ribs, checking his gums, listening to his heart through a stethoscope that seemed too small for the magnitude of suffering it was measuring. "How long has he been like this?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already suspected the answer would be unacceptable. "I don't know," Mike replied, his voice raw from emotions he couldn't quite name. "The Army told me he died 4 years ago. I found him this morning in some kind of illegal facility southeast of here." He paused, watching Rex's labored breathing. "How bad is it?" Dr. Morgan pulled off her examination gloves with deliberate care, a gesture that Mike recognized from military medics who were buying time to figure out how to deliver terrible news. "He's severely malnourished, probably 50% of his optimal body weight. There's evidence of systematic abuse, old fractures that healed incorrectly, chemical burns on his paw pads, and—" She hesitated, then continued with professional detachment. "There are injection sites indicating he's been drugged repeatedly. Some kind of sedative, probably to keep him manageable." The words hit Mike like incoming artillery. He reached out to touch Rex's head, and the dog's eyes followed the movement with exhaustion that spoke of hope deferred too many times. "Can you save him?" "I can try." Dr. Morgan began connecting Rex to an IV line with practiced efficiency. "But I need to know what we're dealing with. This isn't just neglect. This is systematic torture designed to break an animal's spirit. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing." Mike's hands clenched into fists, muscle memory from 20 years of military service making him want to find targets for his rage. Instead, he pulled out his phone and called the number Sarah Mitchell had given him for an investigative reporter named Jennifer Adams. The conversation was brief but productive. Adams had been tracking stories about military dog abuse for months, waiting for someone willing to go on record. Within 6 hours, Rex's story had exploded across social media. Jennifer's article, titled "America's Forgotten War Heroes, the Dogs We Left Behind," featured before and after photos that made grown men weep in comment sections across the internet. The before photo showed Rex in Afghanistan, 90 pounds of muscle and intelligence, alert and confident beside Mike in full combat gear. The after photo showed the skeleton Mike had found that morning, amber eyes dulled by pain but still somehow trusting. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Donations poured in faster than the clinic's website could process them. Veterans groups shared the story with hashtags that trended nationally. Justice for Rex became a rallying cry that transcended political divisions, uniting Americans around the simple principle that loyalty deserved better than abandonment. But the story also attracted unwanted attention. On the second day of Rex's recovery, a lawyer appeared at the clinic representing something called Tactical K9 Solutions. The man was expensively dressed and coldly professional, carrying documents that claimed legal ownership of Rex and demanding his immediate return. "My client has legitimate contracts with the Department of Defense," the lawyer explained to Dr. Morgan while Mike stood in the corner, every instinct screaming at him to throw the man through the nearest window. "The animal in question is government property that was legally transferred for behavioral rehabilitation services." Mike stepped forward, his voice carrying the quiet menace that had made Afghan insurgents think twice about testing his patience. "Behavioral rehabilitation. Is that what we're calling torture now?" The lawyer didn't flinch. "My client operates under strict federal guidelines. Any allegations of impropriety should be directed through proper channels." He handed Dr. Morgan a court order. "We'll be collecting the animal tomorrow morning." That evening, Mike sat beside Rex's kennel in the clinic's recovery area, watching his old partner sleep under the influence of pain medication and IV fluids. Rex looked marginally better. His breathing was less labored, and he'd managed to eat half a bowl of special recovery food, but he was still a shadow of the magnificent animal who'd saved Mike's life in Afghanistan. "I won't let them take you back," Mike whispered, though he wasn't sure Rex could hear him. "I made you a promise, and I'm going to keep it this time." Rex's ear twitched, and his eyes opened slightly. For the first time since their reunion, his tail gave a weak but unmistakable wag. It was barely a flutter, but it carried the weight of forgiveness that Mike hadn't realized he needed. The next morning brought both salvation and complication in the form of Dr. Emily Watson, a veterinarian who'd driven from Dallas after seeing Rex's story online. She was a small woman in her 40s with the intense energy of someone carrying urgent information, and she arrived at the clinic carrying a box of files that she set down with the gravity of evidence in a murder trial. "I used to work for Tactical K9 Solutions," she announced without preamble. "I quit 3 months ago when I couldn't stomach what Colonel Mitchell was doing to those animals." She opened the box, revealing hundreds of photographs and medical records. "This is documentation of systematic abuse designed to break emotional bonds between military dogs and their handlers." The photographs were horrific. Dogs subjected to electric shock therapy, forced to endure stress positions for hours, injected with experimental drugs that left them catatonic. But it was the medical records that provided the most damning evidence. Detailed notes about correcting anthropomorphic behaviors and eliminating handler dependency. "Mitchell believes that military dogs are too attached to their human partners," Dr. Watson explained, her voice shaking with suppressed anger. "He thinks it makes them less effective in combat, so he developed a program to break those bonds through what he calls behavioral modification." Mike studied a photograph that showed Rex strapped to a metal table, electrodes attached to his neck, his eyes wide with terror and confusion. The image was dated 18 months ago. Rex had been suffering in that place for over 2 years, while Mike grieved for a dog he thought was dead. "Why didn't you come forward sooner?" Mike asked, though his tone carried understanding rather than accusation. "Mitchell has connections throughout the military establishment." "I tried going through official channels, but my complaints disappeared into bureaucratic black holes. I needed someone like you, someone with credibility and a personal connection to one of the victims." Dr. Watson pulled out a thick file labeled Rex, Subject 47. "But I've been documenting everything, waiting for the right moment." The right moment arrived the next day in the form of Jennifer Adams and a camera crew from a national news network. Rex's story had grown beyond social media into mainstream coverage, and the additional evidence from Dr. Watson transformed it from an animal welfare story into a military scandal with implications that reached the highest levels of government. Colonel James Mitchell, retired, agreed to an interview that he clearly thought would allow him to control the narrative. He was a man in his 60s with silver hair and the rigid posture of career military, wearing a suit that couldn't quite hide the bearing of someone accustomed to unquestioned authority. His office was decorated with commendations and photographs from a distinguished service record that made his current actions all the more incomprehensible. These animals cost taxpayers millions of dollars in training and deployment, Mitchell explained to the camera with the confidence of someone stating obvious facts. When they develop excessive emotional dependencies on individual handlers, they become less effective assets. My facility corrects these behavioral deficiencies. The interviewer, a veteran correspondent named Robert Chen, leaned forward slightly. "Colonel, we have documentation showing that your corrections include electric shock therapy and prolonged sensory deprivation. How do you justify these methods?" Mitchell's expression never wavered. "Military effectiveness requires difficult decisions. These animals are tools of war, not pets. Emotional attachments compromise their ability to serve multiple handlers across different deployments. What about Rex, specifically? He saved his handler's life multiple times in Afghanistan. How does torturing him serve military effectiveness? For the first time, Mitchell's composure cracked slightly. That animal's excessive handler dependency made him unreliable for reassignment. The behavioral modification program was designed to break him, Chen interrupted. According to Dr. Emily Watson, who worked at your facility, you specifically targeted dogs that showed strong bonds with their handlers. Mitchell's jaw tightened. Dr. Watson was terminated for failure to follow protocols. Her allegations are those of a disgruntled employee seeking attention. The interview aired on primetime television, followed by a panel discussion that included military experts, animal behaviorists, and Tommy Rodriguez, a Marine veteran who'd lost his own military working dog to bureaucratic indifference. The public reaction was swift and unforgiving. Mitchell's facility was surrounded by protesters within hours, and federal investigators announced a full investigation into military dog welfare programs. But while the media circus swirled around issues of policy and accountability, Mike remained focused on the only thing that truly mattered: Rex's recovery. Each day brought small improvements: better appetite, stronger breathing, moments of alertness that reminded Mike of the dog who'd once bounded across Afghan mountainsides with the joy of an animal born to serve. On the 5th day, Rex managed to stand on his own for the first time since the rescue. His legs trembled with the effort, and he could only maintain the position for a few seconds, but his tail wagged with genuine enthusiasm when Mike praised him in German. Guter Hund, Rex. Sehr gut. Dr. Morgan cautiously optimistic about Rex's progress, but she warned Mike that the psychological damage might never fully heal. Dogs like Rex form bonds that last lifetimes. What Mitchell did wasn't just physical abuse. It was a systematic assault on everything that made Rex who he was. That night, Mike made a decision that felt both inevitable and terrifying. He called Sarah Mitchell and asked her to meet him at the clinic. When she arrived, carrying coffee and wearing the expression of someone prepared for difficult conversations, Mike explained his plan to fight the court order that would return Rex to Mitchell's custody. "I need a lawyer," he said simply. "Someone who understands that this isn't just about one dog, it's about whether we keep our promises to the ones who've kept theirs to us." Sarah studied Rex, who was sleeping peacefully in his recovery kennel, his breathing steady and strong for the first time in 4 years. "I know someone," she said finally. "She specializes in military cases, and she's been following your story." She paused, reaching out to touch Mike's hand. "But you need to understand, fighting this could take everything you have. Mitchell has resources and connections. He won't give up easily." Mike looked at Rex, remembering amber eyes watching him board a transport plane with the trust of an animal who believed his human would never abandon him. "Then I guess it's a good thing Marines don't give up easily either." The Travis County Courthouse in Austin had witnessed its share of dramatic legal battles over the decades, but the case of Harrison Verstebos Tactical K9 Solutions drew crowds that spilled beyond the gallery into the hallway, where veterans in wheelchairs sat beside soccer moms clutching printouts of Rex's story, and college students live tweeting updates with hashtags that had become rallying cries for military dog welfare reform. Judge Margaret Sullivan, a no-nonsense woman in her 50s, who'd earned her reputation handling complex civil rights cases, called for order as the packed courtroom buzzed with the energy of people who'd invested their emotions in an outcome that would determine more than just one dog's fate. Rex himself lay quietly beside Mike's chair at the plaintiff's table, his weight now up to 72 pounds after 2 weeks of intensive veterinary care, his coat beginning to show patches of the lustrous brown that Mike remembered from Afghanistan. The defense table was occupied by Colonel James Mitchell and a team of lawyers from a prestigious Austin firm that specialized in military contracts. Mitchell wore his dress blue uniform despite his retirement, the ribbons and decorations creating a visual reminder of 30 years of distinguished service that made his current situation all the more incomprehensible. He sat ramrod straight, his gray eyes fixed on some point beyond the judge's bench, his expression betraying nothing of whatever emotions might be churning beneath that military bearing. Mike's attorney, Diana Reeves, was a former JAG officer who'd transitioned to civilian practice specializing in veterans' rights cases. She was a compact woman with steel-gray hair and the kind of commanding presence that came from years of arguing cases in military courts where lives and careers hung in the balance. Her opening statement cut through the legal complexities to focus on the fundamental question that had brought them all here. Your Honor, this case is about whether a promise made in combat retains its sacred nature in a civilian courtroom, Reeves began, her voice carrying to every corner of the gallery. Sergeant Michael Harrison promised his military working dog partner that he would bring him home safely. The United States Army broke that promise by falsely reporting Rex's death and secretly transferring him to a facility where he was systematically tortured for over 2 years. The defense objected immediately, arguing that the terms promise and torture were inflammatory and legally irrelevant. Judge Sullivan overruled, noting that the emotional context of human-animal military partnerships was central to determining ownership rights, and that the court had already reviewed extensive evidence of abuse. Mitchell's lead attorney, a silver-haired man named Charles Whitmore, who commanded fees that small countries envied, painted a different picture during his opening statement. He described a complex world of military logistics, where difficult decisions about resource allocation required dispassionate analysis rather than emotional attachment. Colonel Mitchell is a decorated veteran who has dedicated his life to improving military effectiveness, Whitmore argued. The behavioral modification program at Tactical K9 Solutions was designed to create more versatile military assets, dogs that could serve effectively with multiple handlers, rather than forming dependencies that limited their operational utility. The first day of testimony established the timeline of Rex's disappearance and reappearance. Military records showed that Rex had been officially transferred to a rehabilitation facility after exhibiting what bureaucratic language described as excessive handler fixation syndrome. The paperwork was signed by officers who testified they'd never heard of such a syndrome and had approved the transfer based on assurances that Rex would receive appropriate care before retirement to civilian life. Dr. Emily Watson took the stand on the second day, her testimony providing clinical details that left several gallery members in tears. She described arriving at Mitchell's facility with expectations of treating routine injuries and behavioral issues, only to discover a systematic program designed to break the psychological bonds between military dogs and their handlers. The colonel believed that emotional attachments made military working dogs less effective, Dr. Watson testified, her voice steady despite the obvious difficulty of recounting what she'd witnessed. He used a combination of electric shock therapy, sensory deprivation, and chemical restraints to induce what he called handler independence. The defense cross-examination was aggressive, focusing on Dr. Watson's departure from the facility and her motivations for speaking out. Whitmore suggested that her testimony was colored by professional disagreements and personal animosity toward Colonel Mitchell. "Isn't it true, Dr. Watson, that you were terminated for failure to follow established protocols?" Whitmore asked, his tone suggesting that her credibility was fundamentally compromised. Dr. Watson straightened in the witness chair, her composure unshaken. "I was terminated for refusing to participate in animal abuse. Colonel Mitchell ordered me to increase the intensity of shock treatments beyond any reasonable therapeutic level. When I refused, he accused me of being emotionally compromised by the animals I was supposed to be helping. The prosecution then called a series of expert witnesses who testified about the psychological and physiological effects of trauma on military working dogs. Dr. Rachel Martinez, a veterinary behaviorist from Texas A&M, explained that the bonds between military dogs and their handlers served legitimate tactical purposes rather than representing problematic dependencies. These relationships are built through shared danger and mutual reliance, Dr. Martinez testified. Dogs like Rex don't just follow commands. They read their handler's body language, anticipate threats, and make split-second decisions that can save lives. Breaking these bonds doesn't create more versatile assets. It creates traumatized animals that have lost their primary motivation for service. Tommy Rodriguez took the stand as a witness to the broader implications of military dog welfare policies. He testified about losing his own military working dog, a Belgian Malinois named Bruno, to a bureaucratic system that treated loyal animals as disposable equipment. His voice cracked as he described learning of Bruno's death 6 months after his own return from deployment, when a clerical error revealed that Bruno had been euthanized due to behavioral issues that were never clearly defined. "These dogs save our lives," Tommy testified, looking directly at Colonel Mitchell. "They charge into gunfire because they trust us to take care of them. When we break that trust, we break something sacred about the warrior bond." The defense strategy became clear during Colonel Mitchell's testimony on the third day. Rather than denying the harsh treatment at his facility, Mitchell attempted to justify it as necessary for military effectiveness. His testimony revealed a man whose worldview had been shaped by decades of making life-and-death decisions in environments where sentiment could be fatal. Military working dogs represent significant investments in training and deployment costs, Mitchell testified, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to explaining complex operations to civilian oversight committees. When these animals develop excessive attachments to individual handlers, they become less versatile and more difficult to redeploy. The behavioral modification program was designed to preserve their operational effectiveness while extending their service lives. Diana Reeves approached the cross-examination with the patience of a prosecutor who'd spent years breaking down defendants who thought military rank insulated them from civilian justice. Her questions revealed the personal motivations behind Mitchell's professional decisions. "Colonel Mitchell, isn't it true that your son, Lieutenant David Mitchell, was killed in Afghanistan while serving with a military working dog unit?" Reeves asked, her tone respectful but relentless. Mitchell's composure faltered for the first time, his jaw tightening as he confirmed the loss of his son 3 years earlier. The courtroom fell silent as Reeves continued her questioning, drawing out details about David's death during a patrol where his military working dog had hesitated at a crucial moment. "According to the after-action report, your son's dog showed reluctance to engage hostile forces, behavior that the investigating officer attributed to excessive bonding with handler," Reeves continued. "Is it fair to say that your behavioral modification program was influenced by your belief that such bonding contributed to your son's death?" The objection from the defense was immediate and sustained, but the question had achieved its purpose. The gallery could see the personal pain behind Mitchell's professional justifications, the way grief had twisted legitimate concerns about military effectiveness into something approaching obsession. Rex himself became a crucial piece of evidence when Mike demonstrated their continued bond despite the abuse. Using German commands that Rex had learned in military training, Mike guided Rex through a series of exercises that showed both his retained skills and his unwavering trust in his original handler. When Mike gave the command, "Platz," Rex immediately lay down, his amber eyes never leaving Mike's face. When Mike whispered, "Come here," Rex approached with the confident gait of a dog who knew he was home. The courtroom watched in absolute silence as Mike knelt beside Rex and spoke the words that had sustained them both through 18 months of combat. Guter Hund, Rex. Du bist ein guter Hund. Rex's tail wagged with an enthusiasm that contradicted 2 years of systematic abuse designed to break his spirit. Judge Sullivan recessed for deliberation after closing arguments that summarized competing visions of military service and moral obligation. The prosecution argued that Rex's loyalty deserved reciprocal loyalty from the humans he'd served, while the defense maintained that emotional considerations had no place in decisions about military assets. The gallery waited in tense silence as Rex dozed peacefully beside Mike's chair, his steady breathing a counterpoint to the anxiety that filled the courtroom. Sarah Mitchell sat in the front row, her hand resting on Mike's shoulder, while Tommy Rodriguez held court in the hallway with reporters who were already crafting narratives about the broader implications of whatever decision emerged from the judge's chambers. When Judge Sullivan returned after 2 hours of deliberation, her expression revealed nothing of the internal struggle that had led to her decision. She began by acknowledging the complexity of balancing legitimate military needs against moral obligations to animals that had served with distinction. This court recognizes that military efficiency requires difficult decisions about resource allocation, Judge Sullivan began, her voice carrying to every corner of the packed courtroom. However, the evidence presented demonstrates that the treatment of Rex at Tactical K9 Solutions exceeded any reasonable definition of behavioral modification and constituted systematic abuse designed to break psychological bonds that served legitimate military purposes. The ruling was comprehensive and unambiguous. Rex would remain in Mike's custody, Tactical K9 Solutions would be subject to federal investigation, and Colonel Mitchell would face potential criminal charges for animal cruelty. But more importantly, for the hundreds of military working dogs still serving overseas, the judge's decision established legal precedent for treating retired military animals as partners rather than property. Rex seemed to sense the mood shift in the courtroom, lifting his head and looking around with alert interest as the gallery erupted in applause. Mike buried his face in Rex's neck, whispering words of gratitude in German, while cameras captured the moment that would become an iconic image of loyalty rewarded and promises kept. Outside the courthouse, Mike faced a bank of microphones and cameras, while Rex sat calmly beside him, the picture of dignity despite everything he'd endured. The questions came rapidly, about military dog welfare reform, about his plans for Rex's retirement, about whether the legal victory felt like justice. Rex never stopped believing I'd come back for him, Mike said simply, his hand resting on Rex's head. The least I could do was prove him right. 2 months after Judge Sullivan's gavel fell in Travis County Courthouse, Mike Harrison stood on the wraparound porch of his ranch house watching Rex chase a tennis ball across the pasture with something approaching his old enthusiasm. The German Shepherd's weight had climbed to 78 pounds, still shy of his prime fighting weight but close enough that Dr. Morgan had pronounced him remarkably resilient during their last checkup. The morning Texas sun caught the highlights in Rex's coat as he bounded through knee-high grass, his tail high and confident in a way that reminded Mike of better days in Afghanistan. The legal victory had brought unexpected consequences. Mike's phone rang constantly with interview requests from national media outlets, and his mailbox overflowed with letters from veterans who'd lost their own military working dogs to bureaucratic indifference. The attention felt surreal to a man who'd spent most of his adult life following orders rather than making headlines, but he'd learned to navigate the spotlight with the same methodical approach he'd once applied to clearing minefields. More importantly, the legal precedent established by Rex's case had triggered a cascade of investigations into military dog welfare programs. Congressional hearings were already scheduled, and the Department of Defense had announced a comprehensive review of policies governing the retirement and disposal of military working dogs. Tommy Rodriguez had testified before a House subcommittee the previous week, his voice breaking as he described the bureaucratic maze that had prevented him from adopting Bruno before the dog's euthanization. But for all the national attention and policy implications, Mike's primary focus remained on the daily business of helping Rex remember how to be a dog rather than a victim. The process required patience that tested even marine discipline. Rex still flinched at sudden movements, still positioned himself between Mike and strangers with the hypervigilance of an animal that had learned to expect betrayal from human hands. Doctor. Patricia Morgan visited the ranch twice weekly, monitoring Rex's physical recovery while documenting his psychological progress for the ongoing investigation into Mitchell's facility. Her reports painted a picture of remarkable resilience tempered by deep trauma that might never fully heal. "He's learned to trust you again," Dr. Morgan observed during one visit, watching Rex sleep peacefully on the porch while Mike worked on his laptop. "But he's always watching, always ready for things to go wrong. That kind of hypervigilance becomes hardwired after prolonged abuse." The hypervigilance extended to Rex's relationship with Sarah Mitchell, whose coincidental surname had initially confused reporters covering the story. Sarah had become a regular presence at the ranch, helping Mike navigate the media attention while developing her own bond with Rex. The German Shepherd accepted her presence with cautious approval, allowing her to pet him, but always positioning himself where he could see both Sarah and Mike simultaneously. Their relationship had evolved naturally from shared concern for animal welfare into something deeper and more complex. Sarah understood the demands of caring for a traumatized animal, and she possessed the kind of steady patience that Rex needed from the humans in his expanding circle of trust. Mike found himself looking forward to her visits with an anticipation that had nothing to do with Rex's therapy and everything to do with the way Sarah's laughter could fill the empty spaces in his house. But the peaceful routine was shattered on a humid Thursday morning when Rex collapsed during their daily walk. One moment he was investigating a particularly interesting scent trail near the fence line, and the next he was lying on his side in the grass, his breathing rapid and shallow, his eyes wide with the kind of panic that Mike recognized from combat zones where everything had gone wrong very quickly. The emergency trip to Dr. Morgan's clinic revealed what they'd all been hoping to avoid. Rex's kidneys were failing. The prolonged abuse at Mitchell's facility had inflicted damage that no amount of good care could fully reverse. Blood work showed levels that made Dr. Morgan's expression grow increasingly grim as she reviewed the results. "How long?" Mike asked, the question emerging from somewhere deep in his chest where hope had been slowly dying since Rex's collapse. "Weeks, possibly a couple of months if we're aggressive with treatment," Dr. Morgan replied, her clinical detachment failing to mask the sadness in her voice. "But Mike, you need to understand. The damage is extensive. We can manage his comfort, but we can't cure this." The drive home from the clinic felt like the longest journey of Mike's life. Rex rode in the passenger seat, alert and seemingly recovered from his morning episode, his amber eyes tracking the familiar landmarks that marked the route to their ranch. He had no way of understanding the medical terminology that had just redefined the parameters of his remaining life. No concept of kidney function or treatment protocols or the terrible mathematics of organ failure. That evening, Mike sat on the porch with Rex's head heavy in his lap, watching the sun set over the pasture where they'd spent the morning walking. The irony wasn't lost on him. After 4 years of believing Rex was dead, after the legal battle to secure his freedom, after the slow process of rebuilding trust and health, they would be granted only a few months together before biology claimed what abuse hadn't been able to destroy. Sarah arrived as the last light faded from the western sky, carrying a casserole dish and wearing the expression of someone prepared for difficult conversations. She settled into the porch chair beside Mike without speaking, her presence a comfort that didn't require words or explanations. "I should have found him sooner," Mike said finally, his voice barely audible over the evening chorus of crickets and tree frogs. "You found him when you could," Sarah replied, reaching out to scratch behind Rex's ears. "Look at him, Mike. He's happy. He's home. He knows he's loved." Rex's tail thumped weakly against the porch boards, and he lifted his head to look between Mike and Sarah with the contentment of a dog who understood that he was exactly where he belonged. The moment stretched in comfortable silence, three beings bound together by circumstances that none of them could have predicted, but all of them had chosen to embrace. The next few weeks settled into a rhythm dictated by Rex's energy levels and medical needs. Good days were spent exploring the ranch property, with Rex moving slowly but purposefully through familiar terrain that had become his kingdom. Bad days were spent on the porch or in the air-conditioned house, with Rex content to lie beside Mike's chair while he worked on correspondence related to the growing military dog welfare movement. The story had taken on a life of its own. Jennifer Adams was working on a book about military dog abuse, with Rex's story serving as the central narrative that illustrated broader systemic problems. Documentary filmmakers had approached Mike about participating in a project that would trace the journey from Mitchell's facility to the courthouse victory. Congressional staffers called regularly for updates on Rex's condition, using his story to build support for legislation that would provide lifetime medical care for retired military working dogs. Mike participated in these projects with dutiful professionalism, understanding that Rex's story had become larger than both of them. But his heart remained focused on smaller moments. The way Rex's eyes brightened when he heard the familiar sound of Mike's truck in the driveway, the careful trust with which he accepted medication from Sarah's hands, the peaceful contentment with which he slept in the exact center of Mike's bed despite having his own expensive orthopedic dog bed in the corner. Dr. Morgan's visits became more frequent as Rex's condition deteriorated. The treatments were palliative rather than curative. Fluid therapy to support kidney function, medications to manage nausea, supplements to maintain what remained of his appetite. Rex tolerated the medical interventions with the stoic patience of a veteran who understood that some discomfort was necessary for the greater good. "He's not suffering, Doctor," Morgan assured Mike during one visit, watching Rex sleep peacefully in a patch of afternoon sunlight. "Dogs are remarkably good at living in the present moment. He doesn't know he's dying. He just knows that today he feels okay, and that the people he loves are taking care of him." The observation provided comfort, even as it highlighted the approaching reality they would all have to face. Rex was dying. Slowly, but inevitably, his body finally succumbing to damage that had been inflicted with deliberate cruelty years earlier. But he was dying surrounded by love, in a place where every day brought new evidence that the humans in his life would never abandon him again. Mike began making lists of things he wanted Rex to experience before the end. A swim in the ranch pond, a visit from Tommy Rodriguez and the other veterans who'd supported their legal battle, a final trip to the courthouse where their victory had been secured. Each item felt simultaneously urgent and inadequate, a futile attempt to compress a lifetime of postponed experiences into whatever time remained. But Rex seemed content with simpler pleasures: morning walks through the pasture, afternoon naps in the shade of the oak tree, evening sessions on the porch where Mike would tell him stories about their time in Afghanistan, speaking in the mixture of English and German that had become their private language of memory and affection. 4 months into Rex's final journey, the call came at 3:47 a.m. on a cold November morning that carried the first hint of winter across central Texas. Mike jolted awake to the sound of his phone buzzing insistently on the nightstand, Rex lifting his head from the foot of the bed with the alertness of a dog whose survival instincts had never fully relaxed despite months of safety and care. The voice on the other end belonged to Dr. Elizabeth Chen from UC Davis, a veterinary researcher whose experimental work with gene therapy had gained national attention. She'd been following Rex's story through the medical journals where Dr. Morgan had published case studies documenting his recovery and subsequent decline. "Mr. Harrison, I know this is an unusual hour to call, but I wanted to reach you before you saw the news," Dr. Chen said, her voice carrying the controlled excitement of a scientist who'd made an unexpected breakthrough. "We've had a significant development in our canine kidney regeneration trials. The FDA has granted emergency use authorization for an experimental treatment that might help Rex." Mike sat up fully, his heart rate spiking as he tried to process information that seemed too good to be true. "What kind of treatment?" "It's a combination of stem cell therapy and targeted gene therapy designed to restore kidney function in cases of toxic damage," Dr. Chen explained. "We've had promising results in our preliminary trials. Not a cure, necessarily, but potentially significant improvement in quality of life and longevity." The catch, as there always was with experimental medicine, lay in the unknown risks and the limited window of opportunity. Rex would need to be strong enough to survive the intensive treatment protocol, which included a week of preparation followed by multiple procedures that would stress his already compromised system. "I need to be honest with you," Dr. Chen continued. "Now, this is cutting-edge medicine with no guarantees. There's a 30% chance of complete treatment failure, a 20% chance of serious complications, and at best we're looking at extending his life by perhaps 2 to 3 years, rather than curing him completely." Mike looked down at Rex, who was watching him with the amber-eyed attention that had never wavered despite everything he'd endured. The German shepherd's tail gave a weak thump against the blanket, and Mike realized that the decision wasn't really his to make alone. It belonged to both of them, to the partnership that had survived war and separation and systematic abuse. "What would you do if Rex were your dog?" Mike asked. Dr. Chen was quiet for a long moment. "I'd probably take the chance," she said finally. "Rex has already beaten impossible odds just by surviving Mitchell's facility. If any dog could handle this treatment, it would be him." The conversation with Sarah the next morning took place over coffee in Mike's kitchen while Rex dozed in his favorite patch of morning sunlight. Sarah listened without interruption as Mike explained Dr. Chen's offer, her expression cycling through hope, concern, and the kind of careful consideration that came from someone who understood the weight of medical decisions. "What does Dr. Morgan think?" Sarah asked, though her tone suggested she already suspected the answer. "She thinks it's worth trying, but she's concerned about putting Rex through more trauma after everything he's been through," Mike replied. "She said the decision has to be based on quality of life rather than just extending time." Sarah reached across the table to take Mike's hand, her fingers intertwining with his in a gesture that had become natural over the months they'd spent navigating Rex's care together. "What does your gut tell you?" Mike looked at Rex, who had lifted his head at the sound of his name and was regarding them both with the patient expression of a dog who'd learned to trust that the humans in his life would make the right decisions on his behalf. "He's a fighter. He's always been a fighter. I think he'd want to try." The decision to pursue the experimental treatment triggered a media frenzy that exceeded even the attention surrounding the original court case. Rex's story had already captured national imagination as a symbol of military dog welfare reform, but the possibility of cutting-edge medicine providing a miraculous recovery transformed him into something approaching a folk hero. The fundraising campaign to cover the treatment costs reached its goal within 18 hours of going live. Donations poured in from veterans organizations, animal welfare groups, and ordinary citizens who'd been following Rex's journey. School children sent hand-drawn cards wishing Rex good luck, and military units deployed overseas sent photos of their own working dogs wearing improvised Team Rex bandanas. but the attention also brought unwanted complications. Colonel James Mitchell, serving his sentence in a federal minimum security facility, granted an interview to a sympathetic military publication in which he criticized the anthropomorphization of military assets and argued that spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on experimental treatment for a single dog represented misplaced priorities. This animal has become a symbol of emotional decision-making that undermines military effectiveness, Mitchell stated from prison, his words carefully chosen to avoid admitting guilt while maintaining his position that dogs were tools rather than partners. The resources being devoted to this single case could fund medical care for dozens of retired working dogs through conventional veterinary channels. The interview sparked angry responses from veterans groups and animal welfare advocates, but it also raised uncomfortable questions about resource allocation and the ethics of experimental medicine for animals. Mike found himself defending decisions that felt intensely personal against critics who viewed them through the lens of public policy and fiscal responsibility. Tommy Rodriguez appeared on several news programs to counter Mitchell's arguments, his own experience with losing Bruno providing emotional counterweight to Mitchell's cold calculations. Colonel Mitchell talks about resources and efficiency, Tommy said during one particularly heated television debate, but he's missing the point entirely. This isn't about one dog. It's about whether we honor our commitments to the beings who've served beside us. The journey to UC Davis took place in a custom-modified RV that had been donated by a California company specializing in pet transport. Rex rode in a climate-controlled compartment equipped with monitoring equipment, accompanied by Dr. Morgan, who'd volunteered to oversee his care during the journey. Mike and Sarah followed in his pickup truck, the 3-day drive providing time to process the magnitude of what they were attempting. The UC Davis Veterinary Hospital was a sprawling complex of research facilities and treatment centers that represented the cutting edge of animal medicine. Dr. Chen met them at the reception area, a compact woman in her 40s whose confidence inspired the kind of trust that made desperate gambles feel like rational decisions. Rex's initial evaluation took 2 days and revealed both encouraging and concerning developments. His kidney function had stabilized at roughly 30% of normal, better than expected but still critically compromised. More importantly, his overall health had improved significantly since his rescue, suggesting that he might be strong enough to survive the intensive treatment protocol. "He's in better condition than I expected based on his medical history," Dr. Chen told Mike after reviewing the test results. "His muscle mass is good, his heart function is strong, and psychologically he seems remarkably stable for an animal that's been through severe trauma." The treatment itself would take place over 10 days, beginning with 3 days of preparation that included immune system modulation and preconditioning with medications designed to help his body accept the stem cell therapy. The actual gene therapy would be delivered through a series of targeted injections over 2 days, followed by 5 days of monitoring and supportive care. Mike was allowed to stay with Rex throughout the process, sleeping on a cot in the recovery room and maintaining the constant presence that had become essential to Rex's psychological stability. The German Shepherd tolerated the initial procedures with the stoic patience that had carried him through abuse and recovery, his amber eyes tracking Mike's movements with the unwavering trust that had survived everything Mitchell's facility had tried to destroy. But it was on the 4th day during the first gene therapy injection that everything went wrong. Rex's blood pressure spiked dangerously, his breathing became labored, and his body temperature began climbing toward levels that could cause brain damage. The medical team responded with the controlled urgency of professionals who'd prepared for exactly this scenario. But for several terrifying minutes, it seemed like the experimental treatment might kill the dog it was supposed to save. Mike stood pressed against the wall of the treatment room, watching a team of veterinary specialists work to stabilize Rex, while machines beeped urgent warnings about vital signs that were sliding toward critical levels. This was the 30% chance of treatment failure that Dr. Chen had warned about, the risk they'd accepted in exchange for the possibility of extending Rex's life. "Talk to him," Dr. Chen called out over the sound of monitoring equipment. "Let him hear your voice." Mike moved closer to the treatment table, placing his hand on Rex's head while the medical team worked around him. "Bleib ruhig, Rex," he whispered, falling back on the German commands that had sustained them both through combat missions in Afghanistan. "Ich bin hier. Du bist sicher. Stay calm. I'm here. You're safe." Rex's eyes found Mike's face through the haze of medications and medical intervention, and something in his expression shifted from panic toward trust. His vital signs began to stabilize as the emergency medications took effect, and gradually the urgent beeping of monitors gave way to the steady rhythms that indicated a patient who was sick but stable. The crisis passed, but it left everyone shaken. Dr. Chen made the difficult decision to modify the treatment protocol, reducing the intensity of the remaining gene therapy injections while maintaining enough intervention to potentially provide benefit. It was a compromise between effectiveness and safety that reflected the experimental nature of the entire undertaking. "We're in uncharted territory," Dr. Chen explained to Mike during the tense hours that followed Rex's stabilization. His reaction was more severe than anything we've seen in our previous trials, but his recovery has also been more rapid. We might be seeing an immune response that's actually positive in the long term. The remaining days of treatment passed without major incidents, though Rex remained weak and disoriented from the combination of medications and medical procedures. Mike maintained his vigil beside the recovery kennel, reading aloud from books about military working dogs and speaking in the mixture of English and German that had become their private language of comfort and reassurance. On the final day of treatment, Rex managed to eat a full meal for the first time in a week, his tail giving a weak but unmistakable wag when Dr. Chen entered the room for the final examination. The initial blood work showed encouraging signs: kidney function that had improved from 30% to nearly 50% of normal, along with other indicators that suggested the treatment might be working. "It's too early to declare success," Dr. Chen cautioned, though her smile suggested cautious optimism. "We'll need to monitor him closely for the next several months to see if these improvements hold. But so far, Rex is exceeding our most optimistic projections." The journey home felt different from the anxious trip west. Rex rode alert and comfortable in his transport compartment, and Mike found himself daring to believe that they might have bought not just time but genuine recovery. The experimental treatment had been a desperate gamble, but Rex had survived it with the same determination that had carried him through everything else. 1 year after the experimental treatment at UC Davis, Mike Harrison stood in the morning light filtering through the kitchen windows of his ranch house, watching Rex methodically work his way through a bowl of prescription kibble that cost more per pound than most people spent on steak. The German Shepherd's weight had stabilized at 82 pounds, 2 pounds heavier than his prime fighting weight in Afghanistan. And his coat had regained the lustrous brown that caught sunlight like burnished copper. The transformation was nothing short of miraculous. Dr. Chen's cautious optimism had proven justified as monthly blood work consistently showed kidney function hovering around 70% of normal. Not perfect, but sufficient to support an active, comfortable life. Rex moved through his daily routines with energy that reminded Mike of their early days together, bounding across the pasture in pursuit of tennis balls with enthusiasm that made the experimental treatment's risks seem like distant memories. The ranch itself had evolved to accommodate their new reality. What had begun as a simple homestead designed for a divorced veteran living alone had transformed into something approaching a sanctuary. The main house remained unchanged, but Mike had added a climate-controlled kennel facility capable of housing 8 dogs, along with an office that served as headquarters for the Harrison Foundation for Military Working Dog Welfare. The foundation had emerged organically from the attention surrounding Rex's case. Donations that had initially funded legal fees and medical expenses continued flowing in from veterans, animal lovers, and ordinary citizens who'd been moved by Rex's story. Rather than keeping the surplus funds, Mike had established a non-profit organization dedicated to providing medical care and retirement support for military working dogs whose service had earned them something better than abandonment. Tommy Rodriguez had joined as the foundation's operations director, bringing his own experience with military dog welfare issues and a network of contacts throughout the veterans community. Together, they developed programs that addressed the systemic problems that had allowed Rex's abuse to occur in the first place: advocacy for legislative reform, funding for emergency medical care, and support for handlers seeking to adopt their former partners. The work provided Mike with a sense of purpose that had been missing since his retirement from the Marines. Each case that crossed his desk reminded him of Rex's journey from abandoned victim to symbol of resilience, and each successful placement of a retired military dog felt like a small victory against the bureaucratic indifference that had nearly cost Rex his life. Sarah had moved to the ranch 6 months earlier, their relationship having evolved from shared concern for Rex's welfare into something deeper and more permanent. She brought her own skills in animal behavior and nonprofit management, along with a patient understanding of the way trauma could echo through years of apparent recovery. Rex had accepted her presence with the gradual trust that marked all his relationships, eventually progressing from cautious tolerance to genuine affection. Their engagement had been announced through a photograph that went viral on social media. Sarah kneeling beside Rex in the ranch's main pasture, showing off a ring while Rex sat alert and proud between her and Mike. The image captured something ineffable about second chances and the way love could emerge from the most unlikely circumstances. But the peaceful routine was disrupted on a humid August morning when Mike's phone rang with news that threatened to unravel everything they'd built. Dr. Morgan's voice carried an urgency that immediately triggered Mike's combat-honed instincts for incoming trouble. "Mike, you need to see the news," Dr. Morgan said without preamble. "Colonel Mitchell's been granted early release for good behavior. He's scheduled to be released next week." The information hit Mike like incoming artillery. Mitchell had been sentenced to 5 years for animal cruelty and fraud, but federal sentencing guidelines allowed for early release under certain circumstances. The man who'd systematically tortured Rex and dozens of other military working dogs would be walking free after serving less than 2 years of his sentence. "There's more," Dr. Morgan continued. "My sources tell me he's already been in contact with lawyers about appealing the court's decision regarding Rex's custody. He's claiming that new evidence supports his position that Rex should be considered government property." Mike looked out the kitchen window at Rex, who was dozing peacefully in his favorite patch of morning sunshine, completely unaware that the man who'd nearly destroyed him was about to re-enter their lives. The German Shepherd's contentment felt suddenly fragile, a peace that could be shattered by legal challenges and the kind of bureaucratic warfare that had characterized their entire relationship. The legal team that had secured their initial victory was confident that Mitchell's appeal would fail, but confidence wasn't the same as certainty. The law regarding military working dog ownership remained complex and evolving, and Mitchell's connections within the military establishment provided him with resources that could make even frivolous challenges expensive and time-consuming to defend against. "He can't actually get Rex back, can he?" Sarah asked that evening, as they sat on the porch watching Rex explore the fence line with the methodical thoroughness that had made him an effective bomb detection dog. "Probably not," Mike replied, though his tone carried less conviction than his words. but he can make our lives hell trying. Legal challenges, media campaigns, harassment through official channels. Mitchell knows how to work the system. The first indication of Mitchell's strategy arrived 3 days later in the form of a federal lawsuit challenging not just Rex's custody, but the entire legal framework that had granted military working dogs protection under civilian law. The suit argued that Judge Sullivan's decision had exceeded judicial authority and created dangerous precedents that undermined military discipline and resource allocation. The media coverage was immediate and intense, with news outlets framing the story as a battle between competing visions of military service and animal welfare. Mitchell appeared on conservative news programs arguing that emotional decision-making about military assets threatened national security, while veterans groups rallied around Rex as a symbol of the military's obligation to those who'd served with distinction. Rex seemed to sense the renewed tension in the household, his behavior shifting subtly toward the hypervigilance that had marked his early recovery. He positioned himself closer to Mike during their daily walks, and his sleep became restless in ways that reminded Sarah of the early days when nightmares had plagued both dog and handler. The psychological impact of Mitchell's return to public attention extended beyond Rex to Mike himself. The PTSD symptoms that had largely receded during the peaceful months of Rex's recovery began reasserting themselves. Night sweats, hypervigilance, the tendency to scan every room for threats and exit routes. Dr. Morgan prescribed mild anti-anxiety medication for Rex, while Mike found himself reluctantly considering therapy for his own recurring symptoms. "You can't let him win," Tommy Rodriguez said during one of their strategy sessions at the Foundation office. "Mitchell's counting on wearing you down, making you so tired of fighting that you'll accept some kind of compromise. But Rex isn't a compromise. He's family." The reminder crystallized something that Mike had been struggling to articulate. The legal battles and media attention had transformed Rex's story into a symbol of broader issues, but beneath all the policy implications and legislative reforms lay a simpler truth. Rex was home, and Mike would do whatever it took to keep him there. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Linda Mitchell, the colonel's daughter-in-law who'd testified during the original trial, contacted Mike through the Foundation's lawyers with information that could permanently end her father-in-law's legal challenges. She'd discovered documents in her late husband's personal effects that revealed the true circumstances of Lieutenant David Mitchell's death, circumstances that contradicted the official reports that had shaped the colonel's views about military dog loyalty. "David wrote everything down in his journal," Linda explained during a tense meeting at the Foundation office. "The real story about what happened that day, about why his dog hesitated, about how the colonel twisted the truth to justify his own guilt." The journal entries painted a devastating picture of a young officer who'd died not because his military working dog was too attached, but because faulty intelligence had led his patrol into an ambush. The dog's hesitation hadn't been emotional compromise, it had been accurate threat assessment that could have saved lives if the human commanders had listened. More damaging to Mitchell's position were entries describing his father's growing obsession with correcting the emotional bonds between military dogs and their handlers, an obsession that had begun long before David's death and had used the tragedy as justification for pre-existing beliefs about military efficiency. "He convinced himself that David died because of a dog's emotions," Linda said, her voice heavy with years of suppressed anger. "But David's own words prove that's not true. And the dog was trying to save him, not failing him." The journal entries, combined with testimony from other members of David's unit, provided irrefutable evidence that Mitchell's entire philosophy about military working dogs was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of his son's death. When the documents were filed as evidence in the ongoing legal challenge, Mitchell's lawyers withdrew the suit within 72 hours. The colonel himself disappeared from public view, his media appearances canceled, and his appeals to military advocacy groups falling on increasingly deaf ears. The Foundation received word through unofficial channels that Mitchell had relocated to a remote area of Montana, far from the veterans community that had once respected his service but could no longer overlook his abuse of the animals who'd served alongside him. Rex seemed to understand that some fundamental threat had passed. His sleep became peaceful again, and his daily routines returned to the confident patterns that had marked his full recovery. He resumed his role as unofficial mascot of the Foundation, greeting visiting veterans and their dogs with the dignity of an animal who'd survived the worst that humans could inflict, and emerged with his capacity for trust intact. On a crisp October evening, as the first hints of autumn painted the Texas sky in shades of gold and crimson, Mike and Sarah sat on their porch watching Rex teach a newly rescued military working dog the boundaries of their property. The younger dog, a Belgian Malinois named Charlie, who'd been found abandoned at a truck stop outside San Antonio, followed Rex with the attention of a student learning from a master. "Look at him," Sarah said, nodding toward Rex as he patiently demonstrated the difference between the working boundaries of their ranch and the recreational areas where dogs were free to simply be dogs. "He's teaching Charlie that this is what home looks like." Mike watched his old partner guide the traumatized younger dog with gentle authority, and he understood that Rex's story had come full circle. The dog who'd been saved was now saving others, passing on the hard-won knowledge that humans could be trusted, that homes could be permanent, and that loyalty given freely was always worth more than service extracted through force. As the sun set over the pasture where Rex had learned to play again, Mike felt the deep satisfaction of promises kept and faith rewarded. The war was over, the battles had been won, and the dog who'd never stopped believing in the possibility of coming home had finally brought them all to a place where tomorrow held nothing but possibilities. At 74 years old, Mike Harrison stood on the porch of the ranch that had become a sanctuary for both broken hearts and healing souls, watching Rex, now 10 years old, gently guide a trembling young German shepherd named Hope toward her first taste of genuine safety. The morning Texas sun caught the silver in both man and dog's hair, creating a portrait of dignity earned through service and sacrifice. Rex's arthritis slowed his movements, but his amber eyes still held the unwavering kindness that had survived torture and emerged stronger. The experimental treatment had given them 6 precious years together. Years filled with quiet mornings, peaceful evenings, and the daily miracle of trust restored. Sarah appeared beside him, her hand finding his with the natural ease of two people who'd learned that love could bloom even in soil salted by trauma. Behind them, the Harrison Foundation had grown to serve over 300 military working dogs, each one a testament to the truth that loyalty deserved loyalty in return. Rex lifted his graying muzzle toward Mike, his tail wagging slowly but surely, the same rhythm that had sustained them both through the longest war either had ever fought. Some battles, Mike reflected, were worth everything they cost, especially when victory looked like coming home. Tell us in the comments, have you ever had a loyal companion, human or animal, who changed your life through their unwavering devotion? What lesson about loyalty and second chances resonates most deeply with your own journey?